The wind screamed down from the Bitterroot Mountains, carrying snow so thick a man couldn't see his own hands. Inside most cabins along the Clearwater River Valley, trappers huddled by their fireplaces, feeding log after log into flames that never seemed warm enough. They were burning through their winter woodpiles at an alarming rate. Some men were already rationing, calculating whether they had enough fuel to make it to spring. In one cabin, set back from the river in a stand of old-growth pine, a single massive log burned in the fireplace. It had been burning for 6 days already. The man who lived there, Lars Magnusson, sat comfortably in his chair, working on his trap repairs without the heavy coat the other trappers wore indoors. His cabin was warm, not just tolerable but genuinely warm, and that single log would burn for another 5 days before he needed to replace it. 2 miles downriver, a group of trappers gathered in William Peterson's cabin, the largest in the settlement. They were discussing Magnusson, and they were not being kind. "That fool Swede with his ridiculous fire," Peterson said, shaking his head. "He's going to freeze to death trying to prove some point about being smarter than everyone else." "I saw it myself," another trapper named Dutch Henry added. "One log. Just one log, standing upright in his fireplace with some cuts in it." "That's not a fire. That's kindling. He'll be begging for firewood before February." The Mockery had started in October of 1836 when Magnusson first demonstrated his technique to a curious neighbor. The neighbor had spread the word, and soon every trapper in the valley knew about the crazy Swede who thought he could heat his cabin with one log. They called it wasteful because the logs he used were massive, easily 3 feet across and 5 feet tall. They called it dangerous because everyone knew a proper fire needed constant feeding and tending. They called it impossible because their own experience told them that no single log, no matter how large, could burn long enough to matter. They were wrong. And before the winter of 1836 and 1837 ended, every trapper in the Clearwater River Valley would understand exactly how wrong they had been. But understanding came at a price. That winter would test every assumption about fire, about survival, and about the difference between doing things the way everyone does them and doing things the way that actually works. Lars Magnusson was not a typical mountain man. Born in Sweden in 1804, he grew up in the forests of Dalarna, a region known for its harsh winters and its skilled woodsmen. His father was a charcoal burner, one of the men who turned wood into charcoal through carefully controlled fires that burned for days or weeks at a time. This was not simple work. It required understanding how wood burns, how airflow affects combustion, and how to manage a fire that must burn slowly and steadily, without human intervention for extended periods. Young Lars learned these lessons at his father's side. He learned that wood doesn't just burn, it undergoes a complex process of pyrolysis where heat breaks down the wood's cellular structure, releasing gases that ignite and produce flame. He learned that controlling the air supply to a fire controls its burn rate. He learned that different woods burn differently, that moisture content matters enormously, and that the geometry of how you arrange fuel determines how efficiently it burns. He also learned about the Swedish torch, called a finnelljus or fin candle in his homeland. This was an ancient technique used by soldiers, travelers, and woodsmen who needed reliable heat and light without constantly tending a fire. The method was simple in concept, but required skill in execution. Take a large log, cut it into sections with vertical cuts that don't go all the way through the bottom, creating a log that's divided into quarters or eighths, but still held together at the base. Stand it upright. Start the fire at the top in the center where the cuts meet, and it will burn down slowly from the inside, the cuts acting as air channels that feed oxygen to the fire. A properly prepared Swedish torch could burn for hours, providing heat and a flat top surface for cooking, all while requiring no attention. It was a brilliant piece of practical engineering developed over centuries by people who lived in forests and needed efficient ways to use wood. Lars had used Swedish torches many times in Sweden, but they were typically small affairs, logs a few inches across that burned for 2 to 4 hours. They were useful for travelers or hunters who needed a quick fire that wouldn't spread. But Lars had always wondered if the principle could be scaled up. Could a massive log, 3 feet across and 5 feet tall, burn for days instead of hours? Could it produce enough heat to warm a cabin through a mountain winter? He came to America in 1828, drawn like so many young men by stories of opportunity in the New World. He worked on farms in Pennsylvania for 2 years, saving money. Then in 1830, news of the fur trade in the Rocky Mountains reached him. He joined a brigade heading west, working as a camp tender and learning the trapping trade. By 1834, he had enough experience and capital to strike out on his own. He filed a claim on land in the Clearwater River Valley, a region rich with beaver and close enough to Fort Hall for trade, but remote enough to avoid the competition that had stripped many areas of fur-bearing animals. He spent the summer of 1834 building his cabin, and he built it with one specific goal in mind. He would test whether a massive Swedish torch could heat a cabin through an entire Rocky Mountain winter. The cabin itself was well constructed, though smaller than most trappers preferred. 16 feet by 16 feet, with thick log walls. Properly chinked, a good roof, and a stone fireplace. But the fireplace was unusual. Most fireplaces in mountain cabins were built shallow and wide, designed to burn multiple logs laid horizontally. Magnusson's fireplace was deep and narrow, almost square, built specifically to hold a large log standing upright. His neighbors noticed this odd design when he was building. Some asked about it. Magnusson explained he was planning to burn logs vertically. The neighbors assumed he meant he'd stack them upright, not understanding what he actually intended. They nodded and went back to their own work, filing away another piece of evidence that the new Swede was a bit strange. The first winter, 1834 to 1835, Magnusson experimented. He tried various sizes of logs, different woods, different cutting patterns. He learned that the technique that worked for small torches didn't scale up perfectly. A massive log, if cut wrong, would burn too fast or would go out entirely, smothered by its own mass. He discovered that the number of cuts mattered. Too few and the air couldn't circulate enough to sustain combustion. Too many and the log would burn too fast. For a log 3 feet in diameter, 6 cuts radiating from the center like spokes on a wheel seemed optimal. Each cut needed to be at least 3 inches wide to provide adequate airflow, but not so wide that the sections would separate. He learned that the cuts should extend almost to the bottom of the log, but not quite. Leaving 4 to 6 inches of solid wood at the base held everything together and created a stable platform. He learned that starting the fire required patience. You couldn't just light the top and hope for the best. He would build a small, conventional fire in the center, where all the cuts met, let it burn hot for an hour to establish good coals. Then it would begin the slow burn down through the log. He discovered that wood selection was critical. Pine and fir, the most common woods in the valley, burned too fast. Oak and hickory were rare in the mountains, but he found that large, old-growth Douglas fir logs, particularly those from trees that had died standing several years earlier, had the perfect density and moisture content. The wood was hard enough to burn slowly, but dry enough to sustain combustion. By the spring of 1835, Magnusson had burned through a dozen experimental logs. His neighbors saw the massive stumps he left behind, each one showing the characteristic pattern of internal burning, and they shook their heads. The Swede was wasting good firewood on his strange experiments. A single one of those massive logs, cut into normal lengths, would have provided fuel for a week or more of conventional fires. Burning them as single pieces seemed extravagant and pointless. But Magnusson knew something they didn't. He had kept careful records. A conventional fire in his cabin required 4 to 6 logs per day to maintain adequate warmth. Cutting and hauling that much wood was exhausting, time-consuming work. It took roughly 3 to 4 hours of labor per day just to keep the fire going. Over a 6-month winter, that was 500 to 600 hours of work, dedicated solely to firewood. His experimental Swedish torches, even the ones that didn't work perfectly, had burned for 2 to 5 days each. The best one had burned for 7 days before exhausting itself. The labor to prepare one torch was significant, certainly. Finding the right log took time. Transporting a log that weighed 800 to 1,000 pounds required a horse or mule and a drag sled. Cutting the vertical channels with a crosscut saw was hard work, taking most of a day. But even accounting for all that labor, a log that burned for a week required far less total effort than cutting, hauling, and feeding conventional firewood for that same week, and the heat output was superior. The conventional fire fluctuated constantly, hot when freshly fed, cooling down between feedings. The Swedish torch burned steadily, maintaining a consistent temperature that was actually more comfortable and used the fuel more efficiently. By the summer of 1836, Magnusson had perfected his technique. He knew exactly what kind of log he needed, how to cut it, how to position it, and how to start it. He spent that summer preparing for winter. He located 8 massive Douglas fir logs, each one carefully selected, dead standing trees, at least 3 feet in diameter at the base, as straight as possible, 5 to 6 feet of usable length. He cut them down, transported them to his cabin, and prepared them. The preparation was meticulous. First, he stripped any remaining bark. Bark contained moisture and impurities that would create excessive smoke. Then he let the logs sit for 2 months to air dry further. In late August, he began cutting the vertical channels. Each log got 6 cuts, radiating from the center like a star. The cuts were 3 to 4 inches wide, cut with a crosscut saw and a chisel. The work was exhausting. Each log took 6 to 8 hours of sawing and chopping, but by mid-September he had 8 perfectly prepared Swedish torches, each one capable of burning for a week or more. His neighbors watched this preparation with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. "That's 8 weeks of firewood he's wasting," one trapper commented. "All that work, and he'll probably freeze because he's too stubborn to admit his crazy idea doesn't work. I give him until January before he's cutting real firewood like everyone else," another predicted. "The Swede thinks he knows better than men who've been in these mountains for 20 years. He'll learn," but one neighbor, an older French-Canadian trapper named Baptiste Moreau, was more thoughtful. "I have seen strange things work," Moreau said. "The Swedes, they know forests and cold. Perhaps he knows something we do not. I will watch and see." If you'd like to hear more stories about forgotten survival techniques that actually worked, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss future videos. October brought cold weather and the first snows. On October 15th, Magnusson lit his first Swedish torch of the season. He built a small conventional fire in the center where the 6 cuts met, fed it for an hour until it was burning hot and steady, then left it alone. The log began its slow burn. The flames worked down into the center, following the channels. Within a few hours, the entire center of the log was burning, a column of fire 3 feet deep but contained within the wood itself. The heat radiating from this internal fire was substantial. By evening, the cabin was warmer than it had been with a conventional fire. Magnusson went to bed, adding nothing to the fire. This was the true test. A conventional fire would die overnight without feeding. In the morning, would his torch still be burning? When he woke at dawn, the cabin was still warm. He checked the fireplace. The torch was burning steadily, exactly as it had been the night before. The flames had burned perhaps 6 inches deeper into the log, but there was still nearly 5 feet of wood remaining. He went about his day's work, checking his trap lines. When he returned in the evening, the fire was still burning. No attention required, no wood added, just steady, continuous heat. Day 2 passed the same way, and day 3, and day 4. By day 5, Magnusson's neighbor to the south, a young trapper named Michael Brennan, rode over to see what was happening. He'd noticed that Magnusson's chimney produced smoke continuously, but he never saw him hauling firewood. Brennan knocked on the door. Magnusson invited him in. The cabin was noticeably warm, warmer than Brennan's own cabin despite the fact that Brennan kept his fire roaring all day. "How much wood are you burning?" Brennan asked. Magnusson gestured to the fireplace. Brennan walked over and looked. His eyes widened. "That's the same log," Brennan said. "I saw you setting it up 5 days ago. I thought you were doing some kind of test before you started your real fire." "This has been burning for 5 days?" "This is my real fire," Magnusson replied. "5 days so far. It will burn perhaps 6 or 7 more before I need to replace it." Brennan studied the fireplace, trying to understand what he was seeing. The log stood upright, as tall as a man. The top was a flat surface of glowing coals. From the coals, flames rose, but the flames were coming from inside the log, emerging from the cuts that divided it into sections. The wood itself was burning from the inside out, slowly working its way down. "How is this possible?" Brennan asked. Magnusson explained the principle. The cuts create air channels. The air feeds the fire from inside. The fire burns down slowly, always having fresh air, always having new wood. It cannot burn too fast because the wood itself limits the airflow. It cannot go out because the coals fall down into fresh wood as it burns. Brennan shook his head. "I've been a trapper for 6 years. I've never seen anything like this." "Why doesn't everyone do this?" "Because most people do not know it is possible," Magnusson said, "and those who hear about it do not believe it will work. They think it is foolish to use such a large log. They think a fire must be tended constantly to work properly. They are wrong, but they will not listen." Brennan left, and he told others what he'd seen. The response was mixed. Some were intrigued, others were skeptical. Most dismissed it as a novelty that wouldn't survive the real cold of deep winter. The proof, they said, would come in January and February when the temperature stayed below 0 for weeks. Magnusson's first torch burned for 11 days total before exhausting itself. 11 days of continuous heat from a single log. The cabin had stayed consistently warm, hovering around 60 degrees during the day, 55 at night. No wood added, no fire tending, just steady, reliable heat. In those same 11 days, his neighbors had each burned 50 to 60 conventional logs, requiring constant attention and labor. The contrast was stark, but most trappers still didn't accept it. They found reasons to dismiss what Magnusson had done. The weather had been mild, they said. Wait until the real cold comes. His cabin was better insulated than most, so any fire would work well. The technique might work for him, but it wouldn't work for everyone. November arrived, and with it came serious cold. Nighttime temperatures dropped to 10 below 0. Daytime temperatures rarely rose above 20. The wind was relentless, driving snow into every crack and gap. This was the test. Magnusson lit his second torch on November 1st. This log was slightly larger than the first, 3.5 feet across. He estimated it would burn for 12 to 14 days. The log burned perfectly. The deeper cold didn't affect it at all. In fact, the colder it got outside, the more efficient the torch seemed to become. The contrast between the cold air entering through the cuts and the hot coals at the center created a natural draft that pulled air through the channels and intensified the burn. The cabin stayed warm. Magnusson worked comfortably in his shirt sleeves inside, mending gear, preparing pelts, doing all the indoor work that winter required. Outside, his neighbors were burning wood at a furious rate, struggling to keep their cabins above freezing. By mid-November, the skepticism was turning to curiosity. Baptiste Moreau, the French-Canadian who had been open-minded from the start, asked Magnusson if he would help him prepare a torch for his own cabin. Magnusson agreed. Together they located a suitable log, transported it, and cut the channels. Moreau's fireplace wasn't designed for a vertical log, but they modified it, adding fire bricks to narrow the opening. On November 20th, Moreau lit his first Swedish torch. It worked. His cabin, which had been chronically cold despite his best efforts, warmed up and stayed warm. The single torch burned for 9 days, longer than any conventional fire Moreau had ever maintained. Word spread. Other trappers came to see. Some remained skeptical. William Peterson, the de facto leader of the trapper community, refused to consider it. "It's a trick," he insisted. "There's something we're not being told. Maybe he's adding wood when no one's looking. Maybe his cabin is positioned to get extra sun. Maybe the logs he's using have some special property. It can't be as simple as he claims." But it was exactly as simple as Magnusson claimed. The technique worked. It worked reliably. It worked in any weather, and it saved enormous amounts of labor. By December, 5 of the 14 trappers in the valley had adopted the Swedish torch method. The results were consistent. Logs burned for 7 to 12 days depending on size and wood quality. Cabins stayed warmer. Firewood consumption dropped by 70 to 80%. The time saved allowed trappers to focus on their actual work, tending trap lines, preparing pelts, hunting for meat. The 5 holdouts, including Peterson, stubbornly stuck to conventional fires. They had their reasons, some practical, some prideful. Peterson's cabin had a wide, shallow fireplace that would have required significant reconstruction to accommodate a vertical log. Another trapper, Dutch Henry, simply refused to believe the technique was superior. He'd been trapping for 15 years and had always done things a certain way. He wasn't about to change now based on some Swedes' fancy ideas. Then came January of 1837. A cold front settled over the Bitterroots, and it didn't move. For 23 consecutive days, the temperature never rose above 0. Nighttime temperatures dropped to 30 below, sometimes 40 below. The wind was constant and brutal. This was killing cold, the kind that could freeze a man in minutes if he wasn't prepared. The trappers with Swedish torches stayed warm. Their logs burned steadily through the cold. The thick, consistent heat from the internal combustion maintained cabin temperatures that were livable, even comfortable. They emerged each day to check their trap lines, then returned to warmth. The trappers with conventional fires struggled. The extreme cold meant their cabins lost heat faster than normal. They had to burn more wood just to maintain the same temperature. But burning more wood meant going outside more often to replenish the supply. Going outside in 40 below cold for extended periods meant risking frostbite. Several trappers developed frostbitten fingers and toes during this period. Worse, the extreme cold made their fireplaces inefficient. The draft in the chimney was so strong that much of the heat went straight up and out. They were burning enormous amounts of wood, but getting relatively little heat. By the 10th day of the cold snap, Dutch Henry was in trouble. He'd burned through his entire main woodpile. He had emergency reserves, but he'd been counting on the cold breaking by now. If it continued, he'd run out completely. On the 13th day, he swallowed his pride and went to Magnusson's cabin. The Swede was splitting kindling, a light task that he could do without overexertion. His cabin radiated warmth even from outside. Dutch Henry knocked. Magnusson opened the door. "I need help," Henry said. Magnusson invited him in. Henry explained his situation. He was running out of wood. He'd been so focused on mocking the Swedish torch idea that he hadn't prepared adequately for extended cold. Now he was paying the price. His hands showed early frostbite. His face was weathered and exhausted. He was a man on the edge of real trouble. Magnusson didn't lecture him. He didn't say, "I told you so." He simply helped. He gave Henry several armloads of conventional firewood from his own emergency supply, enough to last 3 or 4 days, and he offered to help Henry prepare a Swedish torch if the cold continued. 2 days later, Henry was back. "I want to learn," he said. Magnusson took him to his supply of prepared logs. He had 3 remaining. He gave one to Henry and spent the afternoon helping him modify his fireplace to accommodate it. By evening, Henry's first Swedish torch was burning. The change was immediate and dramatic. Henry's cabin, which had been barely above freezing despite burning wood constantly, warmed to a comfortable 55 degrees. The single log burned steadily, no tending required. Henry sat in his chair that night, warm for the first time in weeks, and understood fully what he had been dismissing. The cold snap finally broke on January 24th. The temperature rose to 20 degrees, feeling almost balmy by comparison. The settlement took stock. Every trapper had survived, but some had barely made it. Dutch Henry told everyone who would listen about how Magnusson had saved him, not just with firewood, but with the torch technique that actually worked. Even William Peterson grudgingly admitted that perhaps there was something to the Swedish method. He still didn't adopt it himself. His pride wouldn't allow it, but he stopped mocking those who did. By February, 12 of the 14 trappers were using Swedish torches. The 2 holdouts were Peterson, who was too stubborn, and one trapper whose cabin was simply too small to accommodate the large logs required. The winter of 1836 and 37 became the winter that changed the Clearwater River Valley. The technique that had been mocked became the standard. Trappers spent their time more productively. They caught more furs because they could tend their lines more efficiently. They stayed healthier because they weren't exhausting themselves with constant firewood labor. They were more comfortable, which meant better morale during the long, dark months. Magnusson never charged anyone for teaching them the technique. He freely shared his knowledge, explaining the principles, helping people select and prepare logs, troubleshooting problems when torches didn't burn correctly. He understood that survival in the wilderness was a collective effort. Making everyone more efficient and safer benefited him as much as them. The technique spread beyond the Clearwater Valley. Trappers who visited for trade or social purposes saw the Swedish torches and asked about them. They brought the knowledge back to their own settlements. By the winter of 1838 and 39, Swedish torches were being used throughout the northern Rockies, from Montana to Idaho to eastern Washington. The spread of the technique reveals something important about innovation and knowledge sharing. Good ideas, if they truly work, will eventually spread, but they spread slowly, overcoming skepticism through demonstrated results. Magnusson's willingness to teach freely accelerated the process. Had he tried to keep the technique secret or charged money for teaching it, adoption would have been much slower. The specific benefits of the Swedish torch technique extended beyond just heat. The flat top of the burning log provided an excellent cooking surface. Some trappers placed a pot directly on the glowing coals at the center, using the torch as both heater and stove. This eliminated the need for a separate cooking fire in the coldest months. The steady burn also meant more consistent sleep. With a conventional fire, someone had to wake during the night to add wood, or risk the fire dying and the cabin becoming dangerously cold. With a torch burning for days at a time, uninterrupted sleep was possible. This might seem like a small thing, but adequate rest was crucial for maintaining the physical and mental stamina required for winter survival. The technique also reduced the risk of chimney fires. Conventional fires with frequent feeding and variable temperatures created more creosote buildup. The steady, lower-intensity burn of a Swedish torch produced less creosote, making dangerous chimney fires less likely. Several trappers noted that their chimneys needed cleaning far less frequently after adopting the torch method. There were challenges, of course. Not every location had access to suitable logs. Trees needed to be at least 3 feet in diameter, which meant old-growth timber. Areas that had been heavily logged or that naturally had smaller trees couldn't use the technique effectively. Some trappers tried to compensate by bundling smaller logs together, but this didn't work well. The technique required the mass and density of a single large log. Transporting the massive logs was another challenge. A log weighing nearly 1,000 pounds couldn't be moved by hand. You needed a horse or mule and a drag sled. Trappers who worked alone sometimes had to spend days moving a single log from where it was cut to their cabin. This upfront labor investment deterred some people even though it paid off over the winter. The cutting of the channels required proper tools. A good crosscut saw and sharp chisels were essential. Trappers with poor quality tools found the work nearly impossible. This created a market for quality saws, and traders began stocking better tools specifically for this purpose. The economic ripple effects of a single technique were surprisingly broad. There were also failures. Some trappers prepared their logs incorrectly and the torches didn't burn properly. Cuts that were too narrow would choke the fire. Cuts that were too wide would cause the log to burn too fast or even split apart. Wood that was too wet wouldn't sustain combustion. Wood that was too dry burned too fast. There was a learning curve, and not everyone succeeded on the first try. Magnusson became a teacher, almost inadvertently. Trappers sought him out not just for the technique, but for troubleshooting. Why won't my torch stay lit? Why is mine burning too fast? Why isn't mine producing enough heat? He patiently explained the variables: wood selection, moisture content, cut width, cut depth, airflow, starting procedure. This accumulated practical knowledge was as valuable as the basic technique itself. By 1840, Lars Magnusson had become a respected figure in the mountain trapping community. He was known for the Swedish torch technique, certainly, but also for his willingness to help, his depth of practical knowledge about wood and fire, and his calm competence in a harsh environment. Other trappers sought his advice on many topics beyond just fire building. The irony was not lost on anyone. The man who had been mocked as a fool in 1836 was now consulted as an expert. The technique that had been dismissed as impossible was now standard practice. This reversal happened quietly, without fanfare or formal acknowledgement. People simply stopped mocking and started learning. If you're finding this story valuable and want to hear more about historical techniques that modern people have forgotten, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Your subscription helps us continue researching and sharing these stories. The decline of the fur trade in the mid-1840s changed the dynamics of the mountain communities. As beaver became scarce and silk hats replaced beaver felt, many trappers left the mountains. Some returned east. Others moved to Oregon or California. The settlements shrank. Lars Magnusson stayed. He transitioned from trapping to a combination of hunting, guiding, and small-scale trading. His cabin in the Clearwater Valley became a waypoint for travelers and new settlers. He was known as a reliable source of advice about surviving in the mountains. The Swedish torch technique remained part of his legacy. As settlers began arriving in larger numbers in the 1850s and 60s, they often built using different construction methods. Sawmills made dimensional lumber available. Stoves replaced open fireplaces in many cabins. The Swedish torch technique became less common, though it never completely disappeared. Those who lived in remote areas where they cut their own firewood from old-growth timber continued using the method. Hunting camps and remote line shacks sometimes featured modified fireplaces specifically designed for vertical logs. The technique was particularly popular with shepherds who spent winters in mountain camps watching their flocks. Knowledge of the technique was passed down through families and within communities. A grandson would remember that his grandfather had used upright logs in his fireplace and would try to recreate the method. A sheepherder would teach a young man joining the camp how to prepare the logs properly. The knowledge persisted, though it was no longer as widespread as it had been in the height of the fur trade era. Lars Magnusson died in 1878 at the age of 74, an impressive lifespan for a mountain man. He had lived through the entire arc of the fur trade, from its peak to its collapse, and had successfully adapted to changing circumstances. He married late in life to a Nez Perce woman named Blue Bird. They had 3 children who grew up bilingual and bicultural, comfortable in both white and native communities. His cabin stood until the early 1900s, when it was finally abandoned and allowed to decay. The stone fireplace, built specifically for vertical logs, remained standing for decades afterward. Some locals knew the story of the Swedish torch and would point out the unusual dimensions of the fireplace as evidence. In the mid-20th century, the technique was rediscovered by outdoor enthusiasts and survival instructors. It appeared in books about primitive skills, usually under names like Swedish torch, Canadian candle, or log candle. Modern practitioners typically used smaller versions, logs a few inches across that burned for hours rather than days. These were popular for camping situations where you wanted a reliable fire without constant attention. Very few people attempted the massive versions that Magnusson had perfected. The practical challenges hadn't changed. You needed very large old-growth logs, proper tools to cut the channels, a way to transport the heavy logs, and a fireplace designed to accommodate them. Most modern homes have fireplaces too small for such logs, and most modern people don't have access to old-growth timber or the tools and skills to work with it. But the principle remained sound. In off-grid situations, in survival scenarios, or for people living in remote areas with access to large timber, the Swedish torch technique offered the same advantages it always had: efficient use of fuel, steady, reliable heat, and dramatic reduction in the labor required to maintain a fire. Modern engineering analysis of the technique explains why it works so well. The vertical orientation with internal channels creates optimal combustion conditions. Air enters from below, is heated as it rises through the channels, and feeds oxygen directly to the combustion zone at the top. The thick walls of wood act as insulation, retaining heat and maintaining the high temperatures needed for complete combustion. The result is a fire that burns efficiently, producing maximum heat from the available fuel with minimal smoke. The geometry also ensures that the fire is self-regulating. If it burns too hot, it consumes wood faster, which increases the ash layer at the bottom, which restricts airflow, which causes the fire to moderate. If it burns too cool, ash stops accumulating, airflow increases, and the fire intensifies. This negative feedback loop maintains a steady burn rate without human intervention. The steady heat output is particularly valuable. A conventional fire goes through cycles of high heat immediately after adding fuel, followed by declining heat as the fuel is consumed. These temperature fluctuations are uncomfortable and inefficient. The Swedish torch maintains a nearly constant heat output because as the wood burns away at the top, fresh wood is continually exposed. The burn rate is steady, and so is the heat. From a labor perspective, the savings are substantial. Calculating time spent on firewood management in a traditional setup versus a Swedish torch setup shows that the torch method reduces labor by about 70 to 80%. For someone living alone in a remote location, this time savings could be the difference between thriving and merely surviving. Time not spent on firewood is time available for hunting, trapping, maintaining equipment, or simply resting. The environmental impact is also worth considering. Using fewer but larger logs means less frequent cutting, which can be done more selectively. You're looking for specific large dead-standing timber, not just grabbing whatever's available. This selective harvest is less damaging to the forest ecosystem. Additionally, the more complete combustion of the Swedish torch produces less smoke and air pollution than a conventional fire. There are modern parallels to Magnusson's story. Throughout history, individuals have developed techniques that were initially mocked or dismissed, only to be vindicated when circumstances proved their value. The pattern is consistent. Someone with specialized knowledge from a different background applies that knowledge in a new context. The locals, comfortable with their traditional methods, dismiss the innovation. A crisis or test reveals the superiority of the new method. Adoption follows, often slowly and grudgingly. This pattern appears in many fields beyond wilderness survival. In medicine, in agriculture, in construction, in technology, innovators face skepticism until results become undeniable. The lesson is not that new ideas are always better. Many fail, but that dismissing an idea simply because it's different or unfamiliar is short-sighted. The story also illustrates the importance of cross-cultural knowledge exchange. Magnusson brought techniques from Swedish forestry tradition to the American frontier. Baptiste Moreau, the French-Canadian, was open to learning because his own background included multiple cultural traditions. The Native American practice of using fire in ways white settlers didn't understand created another layer of potential learning that some embraced and others ignored. The trappers who thrived in the mountains were often those who learned from multiple sources: native techniques, European methods, their own experiments, and the hard lessons of experience. Those who insisted on doing things one way, the right way, as they understood it, often struggled or failed. Flexibility and openness to learning were survival traits. Modern survivalists and homesteaders can learn from Magnusson's approach. The willingness to experiment, to try techniques from other traditions, to persist despite mockery, and to share knowledge freely are all valuable principles. The specific technique of the Swedish torch might not be practical for everyone, but the mindset behind it remains relevant. Understanding the principles rather than just following procedures is crucial. Magnusson didn't just copy the Swedish torch technique he'd learned in his youth. He understood why it worked and how to adapt it to different circumstances. This deep understanding allowed him to scale the technique up dramatically, from small torches that burned for hours to massive logs that burned for nearly 2 weeks. This principle-based approach applies to any skill. Learning the why behind the how makes you adaptable. You can troubleshoot problems, adjust to new situations, and innovate effectively. Merely following a procedure without understanding makes you rigid and helpless when circumstances change. The mathematical realities of the Swedish torch technique are worth examining. A conventional fire burning 6 logs per day for a 180-day winter requires 1,080 logs. If each log represents 30 minutes of cutting and hauling, that's 540 hours of labor. Add in the time for splitting kindling, cleaning ashes, and tending the fire, and you're easily exceeding 600 hours. A Swedish torch setup burning 12 torches for the same winter, each torch lasting 2 weeks, requires 12 massive logs. Finding and transporting those logs might take 3 to 4 hours each. Preparing the cuts might take 6 to 8 hours each. Total labor is perhaps 140 hours. The savings of 450 hours over a winter is enormous. That's nearly 68-hour days that can be spent on other activities. These calculations explain why the technique spread once people saw it working. The labor savings were too significant to ignore. For trappers whose livelihood depended on efficiently using their time, adopting a method that saved hundreds of hours per winter was an obvious choice once they overcame their initial skepticism. The story of Lars Magnusson and his one-log fire that heated his cabin for 11 days straight is ultimately a story about the clash between tradition and innovation, about the importance of understanding principles rather than just following procedures, and about the value of knowledge freely shared. It's a reminder that the person everyone calls a fool might be the only one who truly understands what's happening. It's a demonstration that different doesn't mean wrong, and that techniques from one culture or context can be valuable when applied elsewhere. It's evidence that taking time to do things thoroughly, even when others mock you for being slow, often produces superior long-term results. Most importantly, it's a testament to the power of practical knowledge. In the harsh environment of the Rocky Mountains in the 1830s, no amount of wishful thinking or social consensus could overcome the reality of cold. Either your technique worked or it didn't. Either you stayed warm or you froze. The Swedish torch worked. The 11-day burn that Magnusson's neighbors had called impossible became the standard that others tried to match. The mockery turned to respect. The foolish Swede became the expert. The wasteful technique became the efficient method. This transformation didn't happen because of clever marketing or social pressure. It happened because when winter came and the temperature dropped to 40 below, truth became unavoidable. The technique that worked was adopted. The techniques that failed were abandoned. Nature is the ultimate arbiter of what works. This story speaks to modern concerns as well. We live in an age where traditional skills are being lost, where people are increasingly disconnected from practical knowledge about how to create heat, shelter, food, and the other necessities of life. We've outsourced these functions to systems we don't understand and can't maintain. When those systems fail, as they sometimes do, we're often helpless. Learning techniques like the Swedish torch, even if we never use them, connects us to a different way of thinking. A way of thinking that values practical results over social consensus, that understands the principles behind the procedures, that's willing to experiment and learn from failures, and that shares knowledge freely because everyone's survival might depend on it. Lars Magnusson heating his cabin with a single log for 11 days wasn't performing a miracle. He was applying well-understood principles with skill and care. The same principles are available to us today. The same careful attention to detail, the same willingness to learn from other traditions, the same focus on what actually works rather than what's socially acceptable. These attitudes are timeless. The cabin is gone. The man is gone. But the technique remains, preserved in written records, in oral traditions, and in the actual practice of people who still use it. The knowledge didn't die when Magnusson died. It didn't disappear when the fur trade collapsed. It persisted because it worked, and things that work have a way of surviving. The next time you're tempted to mock someone for doing things differently, remember the trappers who laughed at Magnusson's one-log fire. Remember how certain they were that his technique was foolish, wasteful, and impossible. Remember how the winter of 1836 and 37 proved them wrong. Different isn't always better, but it isn't always worse either. Sometimes the person doing things differently is the only one who's figured out how things actually work. And if you ever find yourself in a situation where you need reliable heat with minimal labor, in a place with access to large, old-growth timber, you now know the technique. Find a dead, standing Douglas fir, 3 feet across and 5 to 6 feet tall. Cut it down and transport it to your location. Let it dry. Cut 6 vertical channels from the top nearly to the bottom, radiating from the center. Stand it upright in your fireplace. Build a small fire at the top in the center. Feed it until it's burning hot and steady, then leave it alone. It will burn from the inside out, steadily, for days or even weeks. It will keep you warm without constant attention. It will save you hundreds of hours of labor, and you'll understand, in a very direct way, what Lars Magnusson understood in the winter of 1836. That knowledge is power, that principles matter more than procedures, and that sometimes the technique everyone mocks is the technique that actually saves your life. The one-log fire that burned for 11 days straight wasn't a miracle. It was engineering. It was the application of ancient knowledge to a specific problem. It was patience, skill, and the courage to ignore mockery in pursuit of better results. These are lessons worth remembering. The specifics of 19th century wilderness survival might not directly apply to modern life, but the principles behind them are eternal. Understand how things work, learn from multiple sources, test your assumptions, share your knowledge, value results over social approval. These principles served Lars Magnusson well in the mountains of Idaho. They'll serve anyone well, anywhere, in any circumstances. The trappers who mocked his one-log fire eventually learned. Some learned in time to adopt the technique themselves. Others learned too late, after suffering through a winter of unnecessary hardship. But they all learned. Reality is a harsh but effective teacher. The question isn't whether we'll learn. The question is whether we'll learn soon enough to benefit from the knowledge, or whether we'll learn only after suffering the consequences of our ignorance. Lars Magnusson chose to learn before winter came. He prepared, he tested, he refined, and when the cold arrived, he was ready. That's the ultimate lesson of the one-log fire. Preparation based on sound principles beats tradition based on assumption. Every time, without exception.